This review will be a bit different, as I'll be talking about changes made to the story, and I don't have to guess at themes, since I wrote the thing. Before I get into this, if you don't want the story spoiled, go watch or read it. Links in the description. Alright, if you're here, you've either seen it or don't care about spoilers. To answer this right away, Without a Trace is a Slender Man story, one that was years in the making, and for around 4 to 5 years it was just an idea, and nothing like what the final product was. The original idea was going to be a lot more generic to the Slender Man mythos. To clarify, I'm not a fan of the extra Slender Man lore, not the stuff added by Marble Hornets and taken even further by the rest of the community. Mainly the proxies. I think the idea that an omnipresent being that has untold capabilities needs minions is kind of redundant. I heavily despise the proxies added by the creepypasta community. They're all terribly written and serve no purpose other than self-inserting into the Slender Man lore. However, the original idea for this Slender story was a teenager in high school steadily becoming insane and influenced by something unknown to him at the time. Finally, the story ends with him becoming a proxy of the Slender Man. But even back years ago, I didn't think it was a strong enough story to be made. Plus, my writing skills weren't the best back then, so executing it would have been atrocious. My writing capabilities today are not perfect, but better than they used to be. I believe when writing a story, you should go into it with a set of goals for it. Whether that goal is to write something to express yourself or to accomplish something solely for the genre it's in, having a goal is important. The purpose for Without a Trace was to write a Slender Man story that took as much of a realistic outside look at Slender Man as I could personally write. First, I want to talk about the development of the story. Then I'll talk about the themes I put in it, or at least attempted to execute on. I was rewatching the movie Prisoners when it struck me to write a Slender Man story with a sort of the same beats as the movie, minus the dad being a part of the story. It would follow a detective trying to find a missing kid, finding leads that should end the case, but only leave more questions. However, they are all connected to the actual issue in one way or another. This is what got the story underway. The next part was deciding how to write it. Originally, I was planning to do a series of journal entries, but that was going to get really old, really fast. I've read way too many journal entry creepypastas, and nearly all of them are lackluster. After that, I knew I wanted to go third person, then inject journal entries as a way to explore the detective's personal thoughts and understand him a bit more. So this next part will touch on a real-life event, the stabbings that happened in Wisconsin back in 2014. 2 girls stabbed their friend, claiming they did it so Slender Man would take them to his mansion. I was originally going to have 3 girls go missing in the story, and I was a fair ways in before I remembered this case. Not wanting to look like I was making light of that event, I made it a male child that goes missing instead. The next hurdle was coming up with enough content to fill in this story, and let me tell you now, multiple times I considered completely abandoning the project. I didn't feel like I was writing a compelling enough story. I still feel it's some of my weaker stuff, but compared to other Slender Man stories, it excels. The severed hand found during the forest search. This went through a couple ideas before becoming what it is now. I originally had planned for the severed hand to be that of a previously missing kid, but as an adult. The question would be, where have they been this whole time? Then it morphed into being an adult Preston's hand, which would get into some time travel stuff and the idea that Slender Man is capable of being anywhere at any point in time he wants. However, the detective's confrontation with the child Preston wouldn't make much sense then, and also why would Slender Man cut off his hand? Now, technically, the hand, along with the shirt Miles finds in the woods, are minor plot holes. We never get updates on them. But the way I see it, the hand was a result of the human trafficking, and the shirt belonged to a kid James brought to the Slender Man at an earlier time. At the time of writing this, I realized I could have made the hand or the shirt belong to Mrs. Eleanor's daughter, which would have given Miles more of a reason to talk to her. But in its current state, it's not a huge issue. The scene where Miles and Joey get to the lumber mill was originally going to be a much larger event. There was going to be a limited shootout between the traffickers and the two detectives before they began to flee and police backup arrives. Then an even larger firefight ensues. However, the execution was bland and the influence of Slender Man wasn't there. Instead, I chose what we have now, all but one trafficker being slaughtered by a deranged proxy. The next biggest change that actually made me go back and add some context to the beginning of the story was the death of the trafficker in police custody. Like the official story, the detectives are alerted to the crisis with screams, but as they get back to the cell the psycho is in, he's just been strangled, and they see or hear something go by the window in the cell. Joey rushes outside to look for the perpetrator while Miles investigates the psycho. This is where he would find the symbol. This was changed for several reasons. I realized that I didn't want Slender Man to be this direct with his methods. I wanted to portray him as a sort of puppet master. So the challenge was killing the psycho without Slender Man doing it directly. So, he does it by proxy. Ironic, I know. However, how would a non-police member be able to get into the holding cells? They need to be someone who is invisible in plain sight. How about a utility worker? Okay, but I need more than one worker to make this one blend in. Why are there multiple utility men at the station? Power issues from a storm that happened sometime before the beginning of the story. However, I can't just suddenly have this power issue be a thing just for this part of the story. What if I have the power go out at a much earlier point? Alright, let's use the sudden power outage as a reason for the detectives to start investigating the hotspots. Now that this power inconsistency is more common, no one will suspect a supposed utility worker of ulterior motives until the deed has been done. Now, one thing I would like to address. While I don't care for proxies in the manner they're usually depicted, as overpowered self-inserts, remaking them as sexual predators, human traffickers, and mentally unstable divorcees felt a lot more plausible for people that Slender Man would influence, rather than teenagers that offer nothing, other than being fantasies for edgy 14-year-olds to imagine themselves as. After the psycho is killed, I was stuck for quite some time. Just like the detectives in the story, I had no idea where to go next with it. Rather, I didn't know how to lead up to the confrontation in the woods. It took about 2 weeks for me to decide I wanted to do a rush ending. Now, there's a difference between rushing an ending and lacking quality or reason for things happening that fast, and intentionally making the end come at you fast. I made an informed decision to hit the ending at the speed it happens. But this doesn't mean I wasn't incredibly nervous that I had botched it and should have drawn it out longer. However, I like the current state of the ending for several reasons that I will cover shortly. Now for the symbolism and meanings I wanted to convey in the story. For starters, as I stated before, I wanted to depict Slender Man as a puppet master, and in doing so, I wanted his direct presence in the story to be very limited. Hence why I mostly referred to him with that of tree branches, the operator symbol, and the proxies. I also heavily wanted to avoid one thing. Hey detectives, I found this thing on the internet called Slender Man. I doubt it has anything to do with the case though. And yes, that has been used in stories before, not just Slender Man. It's attempting to be meta and self-aware, but I can tell you that no detective with a respectable IQ would consider an internet meme to be a real lead. Maybe a motive, but not a tangible creature. Granted, Miles does find that 2004 report, and it has Slender Man in it. However, he isn't directly named or seen, and they think he's a sort of federal agent. Now, while I believe Slenderman doesn't need proxies to do his usual kidnapping, they did come in handy for all the other stuff. Did James lure children in for Slenderman? Possibly. But as for Preston and the girl from the 2004 report that Miles finds, Slenderman did those himself. The end journal entry, I really wanted to drive in the idea that Slenderman is an anomaly of extreme threat, and we're at his mercy. Our laws, our weapons, and our precautions have no effect on him. He can do whatever he pleases, when he pleases, and there isn't anything our current understanding of the physical world can do about it. Another idea that I wanted to make a point of is that Slenderman is an intelligent antagonist, not some creature of coincidence. The events surrounding Preston's disappearance and the actions of affected proxies are deliberate and planned. Slenderman is not a being of randomness. While we don't know his motives, we know that he acts with purpose, hence why he allows Miles to see him for just a moment before taking Preston away. It was an intended action to show the detective that he is above our system of human laws. Of course, where Miles speculates that the entity has a far larger scope than their town, that's just my affinity for large implications. One of the themes I wanted to get across with the fast-paced ending is Miles and his learned recklessness and somewhat cowboy behavior he adopted while doing border work. I wanted to state two things with this. The first is that sometimes throwing procedure and caution out gets you answers quicker, but the second is that a lack of information can also get you killed, as your team is unaware of your location or what you're doing, and if things get too out of hand, you're probably dead. Now for some extra things about the story. The Casey family is a reference to Casey's vault. Whether or not it takes place in the same universe, I don't know. I don't really care if they do. If you like the idea of a shared universe between this and the Vault series, go for it. Detective Miles is a reference to an old-ass story I wrote on a long-gone channel. Same last name, same job. But that iteration of the detective hunted down Jeff the killer and shot him dead. I was like 17 when I wrote it, but it isn't meant to be the same detective. The kids that went missing 20 years ago that Miles brings up, what happened to them? Was it Slenderman? I have no answer for that. It could be Slenderman, it could have been literally anything else. What actually happened to Mrs. Eleanor's daughter? I don't want to say it's Slenderman, but rather the thing Joey mentions, that like the deserts near the US-Mexico border, there are things in the woods we don't know about. What's the aftermath of the story? This I have given some thought to, but I will probably never write a sequel. I imagine Miles either moves to a different town after feeling somewhat disgraced, or he stays in the town but becomes more of a recluse. I did have an idea that he would attempt to encounter Slenderman again, which he's successful in doing, and ultimately makes him disappear as well. He goes with Slenderman willingly so that he can protect Preston while in the company of this entity, as a way to redeem himself. But again, this will never be written in a full-length script, maybe as a writing prompt at most. Don't hold your breath. Lastly, the beginning quote of the story. I wrote that purely to jerk myself off. While I'm a believer in the paranormal, and I think isolated areas are more likely to have strange things in them, I wrote that as my version of the opening to War of the Worlds. So let's boil this story down to its elements. Plot. Police investigation that ultimately is paranormal, but with a very skeptical take on all the events, even when they have paracasual implications. Characters. A very tight cast of just two main characters, done for the sake of plot progression and idea exploration through the dialogue, also to establish motives and personalities. Themes. Man's futile efforts to combat the unknown with terrestrial knowledge.